I'm the head of the Nigerian Abuja office. And for those of you who haven't heard of the foundation yet, we are a political foundation affiliated to the Green Party. Like most economies around the world, Nigeria's economy has been hit hard by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the figures from the World Bank, in 2020, the country recorded its deepest quarterly contraction since the 1980s at about -6% in the second quarter. All exports in 2020 fell by around 43% and fiscal revenues by as much as 28%. While the IMF projects the economy to grow by 2.5% this year, about 11 million more Nigerians will have fallen into poverty by 2022 due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the latest labor statistics, about 1/3 of the labor force is without employment or working just a few hours per week. Food insecurity has also risen sharply, with food inflation in Nigeria being one of the highest in the world at the moment. The medium to long-term outlook for Nigeria is equally concerning. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only had an immediate devastating impact on oil export-dependent countries, but also accelerated the pace and inevitability of the global energy transition away from fossil fuels. A recent report by the think tank Carbon Tracker estimates that fossil fuel-reliant countries could see a drop of 51% in government oil and gas revenues in a shift to a low-carbon world over the next 2 decades. Even before the pandemic struck, the country's debt, Nigeria's debt, has already stood at historically high levels, having more than doubled from 12.6 trillion naira in 2015 to about 27 trillion naira at the end of 2019. By the end of 2021, this figure is expected to rise to as much as 38.7 trillion naira. And while the debt to GDP ratio remains fairly low, estimated at about 35% for 2020, debt servicing costs have reached worrisome levels. In 2020, Nigeria at federal level spent an estimated 83% of its revenue only to service its debt. The debt service to revenue ratio rose as high as 99% in the first quarter of 2020, as revenues dropped due to the collapse in the global oil price. Around 40% of the country's debt is external. The Nigerian government and international community have, of course, not been sitting idle in the situation, but responded with unprecedented economic stimulus packages, policy reforms, and some debt relief measures. However, the available debt relief program put forward by the G20 countries under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, as the title implies, only suspends debt service payments for participating countries without reducing debt stock. And it does not involve private creditors who are holding a significant chunk of developing countries' debt stock these days, which is also the case in Nigeria. In short, Nigeria faces huge short and medium-term economic, social, and climate challenges, but has little fiscal space, not least due to the large debt burden, to respond appropriately. What was meant to be a decade of action, as framed by the United Nations to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, is starting with the country and many other countries regressing instead of making accelerated progress. And it is against this backdrop that we today will take a closer look at Nigeria's debt situation, present an international initiative on debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery, which was developed by the Nigerian Foundation in collaboration with the Global Development Policy Center and the Center for Sustainable Finance at the University of London, and discuss its mechanisms and relevance in the Nigerian context. To do exactly that, we have with us here today Amara Ekeruche from the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, Kevin Gallagher from the Global Development Policy Center, who is also one of the authors of the debt relief proposal, and Lamido Sanusi, former governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, who is also one of the signatories of an international statement that endorsed the debt relief for a green recovery proposal put forward by the foundation and others. After their presentations, we will invite a number of select representatives from the Nigerian government, the private sector, academia, and civil society to provide their comments on the debt relief proposal and how they think this could be adapted in the Nigerian context. After which we will give an opportunity to all the participants to ask questions and engage in the debate. Yeah, with that, I just would like to thank CC for the collaboration in this event, and of course the speakers for making their time and insights available to us today. And I hand over to Dr. Adedeji Adeniran from CC, who will moderate the event from here going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jochen, and welcome everyone once again to this event to discuss the state of debt in Nigeria and the potential for debt swap for green recovery. So as an emerging economy like Nigeria, debt and development are kind of intertwined issues to grapple with. Debt is inevitable given the fact that as a developing country with the development finance constraint and with the huge burden of development, you need access to various financial modalities. But as experience of the 90s and early millennium has taught us as a country and as a continent, debt, when it gets to some level of sustainability level, could be a constraint, an impediment to economic development. And for that reason, with the COVID-19 crisis, the conversation is around how the country like Nigeria can we effectively manage our debt? What's the state of things? Are we in a crisis already? How do we also manage our way out of this, given past experience around debt swaps for development? So my first presenter, Amara, is actually going to give insight into what is the state of things in Nigeria. Do we want to say we are at the unsustainable level, and what do we need to do in order to actually ensure debt and development goes hand in hand and there is no trade-off between the two kind of issues? So Huma, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Deji, for the introduction. I'll share my screen right away. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today, we'll be assessing the extent to which Nigeria's debt has evolved since 2005, when we benefited from the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative program. The focus of the presentation for most parts will be on external debts. Why? Because external debts and not domestic debt is what lends itself to debt relief. So first off, how much exactly are we owing and who are we owing? The graph to your left is Nigeria's external debt disaggregated by creditors from 2011 to 2019. And the first point to note is how our debt has increased significantly in the past 8 years. So in 2011, it was about $5.9 billion. And in 2019, it's about $27.5 billion. We see a major spike from 2016 to 2017. Now, the second point to note is how the creditor landscape has changed over the past years. The private creditors, which is the yellow block, debt owed to private creditors now accounts for a larger share of total debts. Presently, it accounts for about 40% of total debts. Also, multilateral creditors, the World Bank, the IMF, they remain key lenders to Nigeria. That's the blue block. Now, the third point to note is that this is not only occurring in Nigeria, it's also occurring across the continent. So the graph to your right is external debt, again disaggregated by creditors from 2011 to 2019. And you see how debt is increasing across the continent. Also, private creditors have emerged to become key creditors in the continent. As we discuss further, we'll also talk about the implications of the changing creditor landscape. Now, moving on, with the increase in debt, is Nigeria's debt sustainable? Well, it depends on the metrics that you are considering. The graph to your left is it shows the debt to GDP ratio, which is the yellow line, the external debt stock to exports ratio, which is the blue line, and the reserves to external debt stocks ratio, which is the red line. Now, considering the debt to GDP ratio, it's just about 29% as at 2019. And, you know, it's deemed sustainable. The African Monetary Cooperation Program, the Association of Central Banks across the continent, they've put forward a 60% benchmark for debt to GDP ratio. And so at 29%, we're significantly below that 60% benchmark. However, all the other debt metrics, they suggest otherwise. So they suggest that Nigeria's debt is no longer sustainable. The external debt stock to exports ratio, which is the blue line, has increased significantly. So between 2011 and 2019, it has increased from 20% to 76%. It's almost quadrupled. Similarly, the reserves to external debt stock ratio has decreased from 167% to 70% during the same time period. A key debt metrics that has gained traction in, in development spheres is the debt service to revenue ratio. So basically, how much of our revenue are we allocating towards making debt service payments? The graph to your right shows the trend of the debt service payments as a share of revenue ratio. And we immediately see how this has increased significantly over the years. So in 2011, it was just about 32%, but in 2019, it has increased to 85%. As a matter of fact, the year in 2017, it's exceeded 100%. So we were spending more on debt servicing than we actually had, right? Than we generated our revenue, than we generated in revenue, rather. Now, considering that by these metrics, our debt is becoming unsustainable, are we back to the 2005 period where we had to request for debt relief from the World Bank, the IMF, the AFDB under the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative? Well, the most recent data we have, which is up until 2019, it shows that we are almost getting there, right? So the graph shows external debts disaggregated by creditors from 2003 to 2019. And we can see how in 2004, the bars are almost meeting. We just have about a $5 billion shortfall for us to get to the point where we requested for debt relief in 2005. A second point to note, which I mentioned earlier, is how the creditor landscape has changed significantly compared to 2005. So whereas in 2005, bilateral creditors, the US, other countries, we owed a large share of our debts to bilateral creditors. Now we owe a large share of our debts to private creditors and multilateral creditors that are not as willing to stop debt service payments, and also that are not as willing to, particularly for the private creditors, to provide debt relief, right? So we see under the current debt service suspension initiative, how private creditors and even the World Bank, they haven't yet latched onto the idea. So for the World Bank, they still have to continue making loans to vulnerable countries during the pandemic. And so in a situation where we're at the point of, where we're at the point where, you know, we are in need of debt relief, it has its implications, because these new set of creditors that we now owe, they don't lean, they're not as willing to provide these concessions, basically. Even as worrisome as the external debts data shows, the bigger picture even shows that things are even worse. So, like I said earlier, we focused mainly on external debts, but then there are other forms of debts that by the time we sum everything up, you know, we're even going to be in a worse situation. So first is domestic debts. Domestic debt accounts for about 57% of total debts. The graph on the top right shows domestic debts as well as external debts disaggregated by creditors. And we see how domestic debt, which is the green block, accounts for a significant share of total debts. Also, the non-performing loans that have been acquired by AMCON, Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, you know, these are all contingent liabilities to the federal government. And if they're being taken into account, again, it increases the entire public debt. Third, private non-guaranteed debt, which has increased significantly over the years. So the graph to the bottom left shows Nigeria's private non-guaranteed debt from 2003, before we benefited from MDRI, the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, till date. And what we see is how, you know, debts taken on by the private sector has significantly increased over a contingent liability for the federal government. Fourth, we have project finance, particularly for infrastructure. We've seen a lot of project loans, you know, railway that are being taken, and not everything is accounted for in the official figures. We also have subnational debts. So whereas the state governments, they are mandated to gain permission from Securities Exchange Commission before they issue bonds, not all state governments adhere to the regulation. And so there are some subnational debts that are also not accounted for in the official figures. CBN borrowing to the government again, we see the Central Bank of Nigeria increasingly meeting budget shortfalls for the governments. And, you know, the government obviously has to pay this back. We see the CBN taking a more proactive role in providing development finance to the private sector. For the agri sector, for instance, they're up to 11 different initiatives, Anchor Borrowers Program and the rest. Manufacturing sector, they're up to 9 development initiatives. And so these are all contingent liabilities and outright liabilities, you know, to the government. Now, just a quick recap and to summarize, external debt is nearly reaching the pre-multilateral debt relief initiative in 2005, but the creditor landscape has changed considerably towards private creditors and multilaterals. And this is occurring not only in Nigeria, but across the continent. And it has its because these new creditors, particularly for private creditors, they are not as willing to provide debt service suspension. They are not as willing to, you know, they don't lend themselves to debt swaps so easily. And while several debt metrics point to the unsustainability of debt, particularly the debt service to revenue ratio, the situation is even more worrisome, because it doesn't cover for all debts, right? So it doesn't cover for certain subnational debts. It doesn't cover for the contingent liabilities of the government, whether it's the private sector. And so there's the need to think outside the box, because we're in a new and unique position, not as we were in 2005, for more innovative ways to handle the rising debts, such as debt for climate swaps and debt for development swaps. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Amara, for that great presentation. And I think you raised a valid point around our depth indicators telling different stories. But I think when I come over to you again, the question I have in mind around that is, should we treat these indicators as a typical car dashboard, whereby when you see a red sign, it means danger, I mean, irrespective of maybe it's two light that is red or one that is red. I mean, we have one red and green in some instances. How do we interpret these indicators telling different stories? So we'll come back to you on that. So I will move to the next presenter, but before I do that, I just want to urge the participants, please make use of the button around Q&A section. If you have questions to ask our panelists, you can drop your question there, and they would also be responding to some of the questions before we get to the general session. So I would move quickly to the next presentation by Kevin Callaghan, who would talk to the debt relief for a green economy and inclusive recovery. He's one of the authors of this initiative, and he will speak to how viable, what is the appetite among the multinationals for this, and how would the modality work going forward. Over to you, Kelvin.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. I wish I was in Nigeria with all of you. It's a fairly cold morning here in Boston, Massachusetts, but I think we'll have to wait for that. But it's great that through Zoom I have the opportunity to engage with you. I want to thank the Heinrich Böll Foundation and CC and my fellow participants for the opportunity to engage with you today. I'm going to present a report that we did with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the Center for Sustainable Finance, and some other colleagues, and released last year in November, and tried to apply it to the Nigerian case after that great presentation that we just heard from. And I'm going to make 3 points. Number one, the divergent recovery, which it's now being called by the International Monetary Fund this week, puts Nigeria on financial footing in 2021 as the country tightropes between illiquidity and insolvency in the ways that Amara just shared with us. Just as Nigeria needs to attack the virus, protect the vulnerable, and seize the crisis as an opportunity to build back better. Number two, that the G20 IMF set of schemes that have been put together are a step in the right direction, but fall far short of supplying appropriate buffers for 2021 and beyond, not only in Nigeria, but for other emerging market and developing countries. And thirdly, I'll talk about our proposed debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery initiative and how that could be applied to Nigeria in the world. So the first point, the global economy is at risk. If you look at one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 4 of the World Economic Outlook this year, the good news is that we're back to growth. We're nowhere near, even in the advanced economies, the trajectory towards potential output that we were on in 2019, and clearly still nowhere near on mobilizing the kind of finance we need for a just and inclusive transition towards these goals that we have for 2030 and beyond. But we are restoring to growth. But there's two characteristics of it. Number one is that it's a two-speed set of growth, that the advanced economies that have put together over $7 trillion of quantitative easing and monetary expansion, and over $17 trillion in fiscal expansion, the countries in the advanced economies and China as well are really starting to grow, and there's actually going to be a little bit of a concern about potential inflation and the extent to which these countries will start to put the brakes on those economies and raise interest rates. One of the things that is a big threat to emerging market and developing countries, and Nigeria is no exception, is that if interest rates go up, that could trigger another round of capital outflows, more exchange rate depreciation, and this small window that Amara showed us of $5 billion that is the difference between where Nigeria is today relative to the HIPC era could evaporate really quickly. And not just a sudden shock of interest rates will cause this, but there's a new structural problem in the world economy where there's two speeds of a recovery that'll make investors want to pull out of the slower speed and invest in the higher speed, and there'll be interest rate differentials that will make carry traders see advanced economies as more attractive and potentially triggering capital outflows. A second key thing this week is that the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, put out an important report on the sovereign debt situation in emerging market and developing countries. And they see 72 countries in distress and on the brink. Nigeria is one that they also put in there. And as Amara noted, the majority of this debt for Nigeria is bondholder debt. And if you look at the DSSI data in terms of the payments that are due in 2021, 2022, even more than that, it's 57 to 64%, according to the figures that I downloaded before this meeting. So the G20 did take some steps in the right direction. There is this debt service suspension initiative and a common framework, but these are severely limited. They're only for lower income countries, even though the majority of countries that are emerging on debt distress are in emerging economies. It's only for bilateral official finance, as we saw in our last presentation. That's a relatively small part of the Nigeria case in terms of payments over the next couple of years. Paris Club debt is only about 2% from what I understand, and it looks like Chinese debt is about 12%, so that's something that needs to be addressed. And the third key thing is that there's no real linkage, even though there's great rhetoric and thought leadership in the global economy right now about the need to build back better or have a green and an inclusive recovery. There's no real linkage between any of this debt relief and those kinds of outcomes. I want to quote Mia Motley. She actually spoke when we released our report in November, but she was in Africa earlier this week at the Conference of African Ministers, and she said, "We simply do not have the money, the fiscal space, nor the policy space needed to build the green, resilient, and inclusive development of which we speak." So our group put together a proposal to the G20 last year called Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery that tries to address these fundamental flaws in the G20 architecture to date about debt relief. And it really had three pillars. Pillar number one is comprehensive debt relief by public creditors, not just bilateral public creditors, but also the multilaterals, and I'll talk about how in a second. Number two is the mandate that private sector actors need to play a role. There needs to be private sector participation and involvement in this, and that's of seminal importance in the Nigerian case, given that that's over 60% of payments and a big part of the overall commitments for Nigeria. To get the private sector to the table, because there's no compulsory requirements for them to do so under the DSSI, and it remains to be seen the extent to which they'll really be playing under the common framework, is that we recommend credit enhancement schemes and Brady-like connections that'll bring the private sector to the table, have them swap out bonds for discounts, and some of that new policy space and local currency could be focused on policy commitments for green inclusive recovery, and if there's any new fiscal space, that could be focused on that as well. There are some countries, and perhaps Nigeria falls into our pillar three, that aren't necessarily in debt distress right now, but they want to make sure that their financing is more aligned with a green and inclusive recovery. And they could also participate in a credit enhancing scheme where they could swap out their debt for debt that is linked to sustainable development and Paris climate. How might that look? What might that look like in more specific terms for Nigeria? So what was a DRGR, debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery for Nigeria? Well, if it was truly going to have real participation from the international financial institutions, which are about 24% of the payments that Nigeria has to have over the next year, the private sector, which is the core part, and bilateral official participation, let me talk about each of those in turn. So the IMF, to its credit, it has provided funding for the CCRT so that countries can get grants and turn around and pay IMF debt. Only 26 countries are eligible for that, and it's a small amount of money, just a couple $100 million. That could be expanded, and that window could be open for Nigeria. It looks like there will be a new allocation of special drawing rights. Of course, Nigeria will get some, but advanced economies that won't use them could earmark them with Nigeria. And also, I've written about the skewed surcharges that the IMF is charging countries like Nigeria for their programs. They could waive those surcharges through the crisis. Multilateral development banks are also a big part of especially African debt, and Nigeria is no exception to this. And they're largely silent in terms of debt relief thus far. They could sell gold, as they did during the HIPC period, in order to have a CCRT-like instrument that would allow countries to pay their World Bank debts. But one of the other things that we see as core for the MDBs is not necessarily alleviating their own balance sheet problems with particular countries, but to use their balance sheets for credit enhancement and Brady bond-like activity to bring the private sector in. So that's the next piece here. How can the private sector be lured into debt relief in Nigeria and beyond? I've done a study that shows that the multilateral development banks after the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 have been very reluctant to lend out their balance sheets in fear of credit downgrades. And they've actually been overly conservative. We calculate that the multilateral development banks have been holding on to about $500 billion that they could be lending and still not jeopardizing their AAA credit status. And so if they use some of that balance sheet for credit enhancement and providing guarantees for the private sector to come to the table in exchange for swapping out their old debt for discounted bonds. That's a core of our proposal for private sector participation, credit enhancement, some sort of a guarantee that the private creditors will be paid back for a couple years or something like that in exchange for a discount. And on the Nigeria end, if they get that discount, is there any fiscal space and local currency to subsidize renewable energy, fuel, and energy sources for the poor? I know last year Nigeria got rid of fossil fuel subsidies. That's important from a climate change perspective, but the poor need that, and that causes social risk in countries like like Nigeria. So perhaps if they're in, and I look forward to hearing from you folks if this is feasible. But a possible instrument could be something like putting those subsidies back into place, but for income support for the poor and for other ways for them to get their energy rather than through fossil fuels, not just cutting the energy out. Other possibilities could be over the intermediate term, shifting fossil fuel subsidies from oil and fossil fuels towards renewable energy and social adjustment for those communities that get laid behind. In October, the World Economic Outlook showed that if countries did that globally, that the recovery would be 2 percentage points stronger than if we just went back and turned the old lights on from 2019. There is some significant bilateral official debt with respect to Nigeria. Not too much for the Paris Club, but it's significant, about 12% of payments over the next couple of years for China. Now, China also should be credited, I should say, first and foremost, for being the most active participant in debt relief in the world economy since the COVID era. The Johns Hopkins University's CARI, the China Africa Research Initiative, has a China debt relief dashboard, and they say that China's now provided relief upwards of $10 billion in the world economy right now. Our scheme fits actually perfect for China because China is traditional with long-term bank loans. And that's what countries are having trouble, especially Nigeria, paying back. They could, with some credit enhancement from Sinosure or the China Development Bank, they could convert those loans to discounted bonds the way we did under the Brady scheme with the US Treasury in the 1980s and 1990s in Latin America and other countries. Or in some cases, and I don't know the maturity here for Nigeria, but if Nigeria is paid back a certain amount of those older loans, maybe those loans could be refinanced using the amount that's been paid back as collateral to actually get some new finance that could be linked. And again, for the Nigeria case, if there is a discount, if there's more policy space and more fiscal space, especially in in local currency, what are policies that Nigeria could put in place to make sure that's building back better and building a new growth path that isn't so dependent on fossil fuels and isn't so unequal, and that can help the country build back better. Again, the Paris Club should be participating. Countries are reluctant to do that because you have to be linked to a stiff conditional IMF program, which those are counterproductive in recessions like this. But the Paris Club could provide grants to Nigeria. They could on-lend or donate their special drawing rights to Nigeria. And many Paris Club members have the supermajority in the IMF that could reform IMF programs to make sure that they're more like these flexible instruments without conditionalities and not the ones with the harsh conditionalities that have proven to be counterproductive. And again, if there was such a mechanism, new grants, et cetera, what are the policies that Nigeria could put in place to make sure that any new finance or any new policy space that Mia Motley says is so needed can be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and our Paris commitments and beyond. Thanks so much for the time today. Here's a link to our larger, more global report and our webpage in general. We're about to come out with some new products that go deeper into some of these Brady bond schemes that I noted a little bit today, and have regular research that's coming out. Thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to engaging with this with you folks moving forward.
Thanks, Calvin, for your contribution and interesting presentation. If you check the Q&A box, there are already questions being dropped for you there. And I mean, a lot of people will also want to know in terms of, if you look at the whole debt forgiveness initiative, it took a lot of countries between 5 to 10 years to assess them. I don't know, maybe you have a timeline for this. And a lot of countries are still battling of the proposal you are putting forward to global actors. So you can start thinking about this while we move to the next presentation. And we would have to reflect on these two presentations we have had so far, the eminent economist and the former Central Bank Governor of Nigeria, in person of Mr. Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, to really reflect on the issue at hand. He is part of the signatory to this international proposal about how can we help developing countries. So what is your thought on this? How should we address it? At the local level, what should we be thinking of in terms of assessing this? Over to you, sir.
I think that has disabled my video.
No, you can open up your video now. Yes.
It's been disabled now. Okay, it's opened up. Okay, can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, good. So thank you very much, and I thank the Heritage World Foundation for asking me to participate in this panel. I'd like to make a few remarks. I've been asked to speak around the sustainability of Nigerian debt and also my views on the debt relief for green recovery, probably some comments and additions. My first comment, obviously, on debt sustainability, and if you've been following my comments since my days in the central bank, was that the debt to GDP ratio is obviously, it's basically a useless number. You do not service debt out of GDP, you service debt out of revenues. And if only 20% of your GDP is paid taxes, if you have debt to GDP ratios of 20%, you're likely to have debt service to revenue ratios of 100%. So For a long time, I've been concerned about this idea that if you're at 25% or 30% or 35% debt to GDP ratio, it's fine because you've got countries that are at 80, 90%. In those countries, practically every geography in the GDP is paying taxes. In Nigeria, apart from the oil sector and the large multinational corporations, the formal private sector, the significant, the bulk of your GDP is agriculture, which pays no tax. You've got wholesale and retail trade, most of which does not really pay tax because the VAT is not high enough. And so within a very short time, an increase in debt principles with high interest rates leads to a difficult financial situation. I've listened to the numbers given by Ma, and these numbers, obviously we're all aware that we have debt service revenue ratios now of about 93%. But there are certain other elements of debt that I think we've not paid attention to, which would continue to add to the red flags we have around sustainability. So I'll give an example. If you take the ratio of external debt to external reserves, if you go through the CBN statistical bulletin, in 2011, total federally collected revenue from the oil sector was about 8.9 trillion naira. At 165 naira to the dollar, this would have placed federal collected revenue in 2011 at $55.5 billion. Meanwhile, debt at that time was about 5 billion. So you had external debt to external revenues of about 8% in 2011. By 2020, you have external debt about $33.4 billion, but all revenues in 2020 were about $8.3 billion. So you've moved from 8% to 400% between 2011 and 2020. And this is a serious red flag that I've not seen pointed out in the conversation around debt sustainability, especially given the fact that exports are yet to be diversified and the bulk of our revenues are from all sector, and given what we've seen and what has been discussed today about the future prospects of hydrocarbons as we move into a greener world. A second element in the debt profile is basically the breakdown of bilateral loans. China has moved up to be a major player, and today, out of the $4.1 billion bilateral debt, China accounts for 3.2 billion or 78%, which means in any debt relief conversation, a conversation with China is going to be very important in terms of sustainability. We can't just limit it to the private sector and to multilateral agencies, but it's one party that is a dominant player and therefore possibly can have an impact, even though it constitutes about 10% of total indebtedness, but that is still significant and that would help. Now, coming back to the general macro, the IMF obviously just yesterday released its Article 4 report. The tone was generally very negative. And I think it's important, even as we look towards 2011, 2021, 2022, as the world recovers, to ask ourselves, what is the likely impact of that recovery on the debt situation and our balance of payments? If you look at the COVID period, there was a significant collapse in in demand for foreign exchange for personal travel. This demand fell from $8.7 billion to under $300 million, a collapse of 97%. Other business services also collapsed from 12.3 billion to 3.7 billion, a collapse of 70%. Now, when the world reopens and people start traveling, that is going to lead to an increase in the demand of Forex for travel, and that is going to exert further pressure on the balance of payments. Now, these are the kinds of considerations I think we need to bear in mind when we talk about the sustainability of the debt situation. And honestly, I think it places us in a very dire position, and debt relief is absolutely necessary if this country is going to have the fiscal space to pursue any kind of developmental objectives. You can't be spending 90%, 100% of your revenue on debt service and then have anything to do with and then be able to invest in development. The final point, or the main point I'd like to talk about as far as this whole idea of debt relief for green recovery is concerned, is that I like the idea. I think it's generally in the right direction. I think it needs to be expanded beyond just climate change, and to look at all the SDGs. Why are we where we are today? Part of the problem is that there has been significant underinvestment in education, for example, and healthcare, significant underinvestment in the productivity of agriculture. We've had an agricultural growth that has been driven largely by greater factor intensity, just bringing more and more land under cultivation, rather than increasing the productivity of the farmer. And these are the kinds of things that we need in order to lift people out of poverty and create sustainable growth. The second element is the rapid rate of growth in the population. And therefore, I would suggest that if you're really looking at sustainable development, debt relief can also be tied to very clear, very measurable and implementable population growth control policies. You need to have social policies around demographic growth. There are parts of this country where the fertility rate is more than 8 live births per woman. And again, those societies are also polygamous. Now, there's no way you're going to continue growing at 3.44% when your economy is growing at a slower rate and expect to deal with poverty, and that is an unsustainable model. So I think we need to look at things like social policies around population, around education. I mean, if you have targeted, measurable, scalable programs for reducing out-of-school children, for providing the kind of skills that will give them quality jobs, those are the kinds of things that need to be tied to these green bonds, and not just climate change. Now, as for climate change, we can also, as mentioned, I think, by one of the speakers, we can look at how you can target these investments so that you have renewable energy for production. So one of the issues I have with people when they talk about removing the subsidy on electricity tariffs and how the tariffs are going to go up and why it's a problem is that, you know, we worried so much about the tariffs because we use electricity for consumption. And the bulk of the population is yet to understand that electricity is an input into production and income earning. So if you take away the subsidy by having a cost recovery tariff, you could put that money into small and medium enterprises that will turn that electricity into real production of goods and services and lift people out of poverty. Now, it doesn't have to be fossil fuel electricity. You can, in the same way, for example, use these bonds to encourage setting up factories to produce solar panels, because, I mean, people talk about renewable energy, but if you're going to be importing solar panels from China or from the UK, it's not as effective as if you set up a factory to produce these panels in Nigeria. You've got all the raw materials you need to produce solar panels. So set up factories, produce these panels, and then the subsidy comes in the form of making these panels affordable and the kind of financing you give to the micro enterprises to turn this renewable energy into goods and services. So it's not just about producing renewable energy that will continue to be fueling television sets, water kettles, basically video games. No, you want electricity so that micro, small, and medium enterprises in rural areas can begin to generate. So it's a holistic way of thinking through how do you, because it's not just about green, it's about inclusive, it's about getting to the bottom of the pyramid, addressing the fact that Nigeria has become the poverty capital of the world. And a very smart way of dealing with debt relief is to effectively ensure that this time we put in the right policies and that this money goes into areas that will lead to sustainable development. What happened in the past was we had this debt relief, and then that was it, and everybody turned away. And then we went back to borrowing money, spending on salaries, spending on overheads, spending on unnecessary petroleum subsidies, basically all sorts of fertilizer subsidy scams. And those are the kinds of things that need to end. but we also need to bear in mind that as we take them out, the way to minimize the impact is to address real SDG considerations, education, healthcare, renewable energy, accompanied by training, productivity of agriculture. And this is really about the policy deficit that we've had in the last few decades. So these are my broad comments. I don't know if there'll be any questions, or maybe when later I'll have an opportunity to step in if I hear the comments. But on the basis of the areas I've been asked to look at and consider, these are my initial comments. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mallam Sanusi Lamido for that wonderful presentation. I think the point around with the need for us to move away from debt to GDP ratio to much more robust indicators of debt sustainability is well taken. And also your point that we should look at the debt not just for green recovery, but for SDG broadly. It's also something I think Kelvin and his team, and also all of us, needs to start thinking around as we push this idea of debt swap forward and link it to how country and emerging economy can recover from COVID-19 pandemic. So I think now it's time to actually have brief contribution from a selected team that we've actually selected before this meeting. And we are having them to actually also enrich this conversation to give their perspective and idea to this discussion. The first person I will call upon is Brian Pinto. Brian Pinto is former senior chief economics at the World Bank. During his time at the World Bank, he was one of the arrowhead that discusses the drive for development during the multilateral debt relief initiative. And for that reason, I think he would be more than important to actually give perspective into how do we approach this new initiative. What is different from the past initiative, and what kind of lessons can we pick from the past going forward in this new agenda around debt for green recovery? So Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adeniran. And good morning and good afternoon. I am very happy to be participating here, and I want you to know that I'm making my comments as a friend of Nigeria and Africa, especially of the youth and the vulnerable people. I think it's completely reasonable for emerging markets and low-income countries to expect highly concessional finance to tide over COVID-19 and also climate change, because these are unanticipated exogenous shocks. And in fact, COVID-19 is a once-in-a-century pandemic. So certainly there is a strong case for helping vulnerable countries, including Nigeria. And of course, the resources available to the advanced countries are much greater, a point that Kevin made. Life is not fair, and obviously there have to be some ways of making it fairer. Now, I hope that the organizers are not going to regret inviting me to speak, because I'm going to raise a few questions in the spirit of, in the spirit of challenging some of the ideas that have been put forward, mainly from the perspective of the pre-COVID history of Nigeria. I think while many of you have mentioned the symptoms that we see now in terms of the debt sustainability problem, in particular measured by the metric of debt service to revenue and external debt to exports, there hasn't been any discussion. I mean, I saw something in the report that's being launched today about the Nigerian curse. And I think that that's very important to try and understand what the fundamental causes are of the problems that Nigeria faces today. I also want you to know that I was not involved in the multilateral debt relief initiative. I don't think that that's in the bio that I sent, but I was the main author of the report written in 2005 by the World Bank, which went to the G7 and formed the analytical basis for the Paris Club debt renegotiation, which got Nigeria the relief of the $19 billion that's mentioned in your report. So I also worked on Nigeria in the mid-1980s after the oil prices collapsed, when we had many similar things to what we see today: high black market premium on foreign exchange, a debt overhang, and the fiscal deficit out of control. So history has been repeating itself, unfortunately, in Nigeria. So what I'm going to do, since I know that you're expecting to hear from others, is that I'm just going to say that if Nigeria asks for debt forgiveness, I'm guessing that official creditors who drive the process will ask at least 4 questions. The first, transitioning from fossil fuels to a green economy is not a trivial thing. It's a complicated transition. And what can Nigeria do to make it a reality? The first thing that Nigeria needs to do is to improve general economic governance and oil wealth management and reestablish credibility. What can it do to demonstrate that it has the needed political will? There are certain things that it can do, but which it hasn't yet done. And I don't have the time to get into that. So I'll get to the next question. The next important question is, what happened after the 2000 round of Paris Club debt relief when Nigeria was forgiven $19 billion? Who benefited? Did the poor people and youth benefit? The World Bank's 2018 Human Capital Index ranked Nigeria 152 out of 157 countries. So that's well before COVID started. Poverty rates were extremely high even before the pandemic began. 3, what is the underlying nature of the sustainability in public debt? If you look at debt levels, they are low. And if you look at the standard dynamics based on the difference between the nominal interest rate and the growth rate, the dynamics are favorable. If the issue is interest to revenue, this would then imply the problem has much more to do with the denominator, namely with revenue, than with the numerator. Now, Nigeria has had a long time to get its fiscal house in order, but that doesn't seem to have happened yet. 4, why is Nigeria not learning from its own past mistakes in managing its oil wealth and the related errors in fiscal and exchange rate policy? Why has it not adhered to the reforms that were implemented during the period 2004 to 8, when it received debt relief from the Paris Club? So I think the green agenda is a great idea. I definitely think that emerging markets and low-income countries need concessional help during this pandemic. But I do think that there are other very important questions that need to be answered as well. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for that wonderful presentation. I mean, the 4 posers you actually raised are quite critical. I think it's something like a framework that should guide conversation around, in the local context, around if we want another debt forgiveness, how should we, I mean, it should not be just another debt forgiveness, but it should be something that concretely contributes to the development, such that we don't have a cycle of debt forgiveness over and over again. So thanks for that contribution. I think we will reflect as a country, and government also will reflect on that. So quickly, I will go to the next presenter, which is from the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and in person of the Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Laoye Jayola. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the Heritage Wealth Foundation for having us at this discussion. And I want to align with all that the previous speakers have said. I'll pick back on what Brian said. If I ask what question I asked, who should be giving us any relief? For us to be able to attract relief, the governance structure on the utilization of the reliefs must be very clear. That will show transparency and accountability, because given the history of what we had, nobody's going to look at that. So it's important that we we look at that and put that in perspective moving forward, even as we try, moving forward in trying to get people to support us and all these brilliant things that have been said. The second thing, of course, is that there must be the political will to have targeted policies that will ensure the attainment of all that we have under the SDG, so that when the money comes, we have targeted policy that we are accounting for. But I then have one last rider. We're talking about debt. Why should I forgive you your debt when there are leakages in your system? So what are we really trying to do to ensure that we reel in the leakages we have in our system, so that this pension to borrow money and co is reduced? Because honestly speaking, if we deal well with our leakages and bring in all that we require, maybe we will not even need a debt. But the reason why people close their eyes to whether there are debts or not is because the leakages are things that are things that people in the power class still enjoy. So those are the two dimensions I want us to add to it. But it's good that we've been invited. For us at the NASG, there are things we're doing around that roundtable on debts, on the debt issue, and we want more think tanks and people to work together and make sure that even when we proceed in this area, it will not be business as usual. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Laoye Jayola, for that contribution. And quickly, I will move to Abel Akin. Abel Akin is the head of research and policy advisory at Budgets. So Abel Akin, your contribution quickly.
Okay, thank you very much for having me on this platform. So I think the first thing I'm going to say is that debt relief is critical at this point in time, especially to create fiscal space that will allow for investments in other critical areas of the economy that can incentivize prosperity. However, it also presents, I think, adequate opportunities for reforms. Any debt relief that should be offered to Nigeria at this point in time needs to be tied to specific reforms. It needs to be conditioned. So once you're given a certain amount of relief, there needs to be specific criteria that says that the savings as a result of this debt relief should be clearly channeled to certain areas of the economy, to areas of health, areas of education, through the budget. And not just what's allocated on the budget, but there needs to be specific criteria in terms of what is disbursed. Because often, even when there is success in advocating for increased allocations to health or to education, we do not see sufficient prioritization by the government in how they disburse monies for those sectors. And those are some of the critical sectors that can guarantee prosperity for this country. So say that any relief Nigeria should get needs to be tied to clear reforms, because the last relief the country got, I wouldn't say that a lot of the poor people living at the bottom of the pyramid in this country benefited from that. So that would be my contribution for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hebel, for your contribution. So lastly, we have a representative of the Federal Ministry of Finance, and I've been notified that Mark George will be the person that will be speaking. Mark George, I know you are part of the participants now. If you could unmute your mic and quickly make your contribution, that is visible. Okay, so we are having problem with getting Mark George to actually get to talk at this moment. Vivian, do you want to say something?
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me to your roundtable. Hello, can you hear me?
Can hear you, although the audio is very bad.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting the ministry to your roundtable. I could really see that a lot of efforts have been put in, by the different presenters in driving forward their more debt space and then green energy gas. To look at policy formulation around green energy that supports debt relief. We've taken on board presentations and the questions. We'll look at them. We'll go back and pass this on to our principal, and then from there start working on policies that we address the physical space in terms of green energy and debt relief. Thank you again very much, and then we look forward to working with you in the near future.
Thank you, Vivian Ido. So Vivian Ido is the Principal Administrative Officer at the Federal Ministry of Finance, specifically at the Department of Economic Research and Policy Management. So thanks for your contribution. And with that contribution, I think we will open the floor to everyone. So presently we have just very few minutes. If you have questions, please just use the icon raised hand, and I will call on you. So the first person I will call to ask his question is David Ugolo. David Ugolo, you can ask your question. We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you, David.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just say that first, I'm happy that the panelists did a very excellent job, and I was very impressed by the second to the last speaker who posed some questions which were germane, particularly some of us who were involved in the campaign in 2004, 2005 as Jubilee campaigner for debt relief for Nigeria. We understand the concerns he raised in those questions about accountability. But I'd like to add that the creditors do have a blame as well. And so in the face of seeking for debt relief for Nigeria today, it is not just for Nigerians, it's for the benefit of the global common good. So when we are, the wording is very important. Why the debt relief is for Nigeria is important for the global world because there's repercussion. Because the recent COVID-19 crisis calls for an urgent attention for the world to look beyond just one location. And so that's one issue we must put on board. Then the second issue is about the institutional capacity of the non-state actor. If you recall, the reason why some of the debt relief has not really benefited the people, which is the major concern, the issue of corruption, is that in most of all this negotiation, the non-state actors are hardly being carried along. And this is the really issue that I like to answer. So my question to Kevi is that, what are your opportunity to conceive a framework that also addressed incentive for the creditors that will also benefit Nigerians? Are there likely examples around the world so that it is not like the creditors are the one giving out?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. I think, Calvin, the question is for you. So I will take one question from George Anthony. George Anthony, if you can quickly ask your question. Hello, George Anthony. Oh, George, we can hear you. Okay, so I think George is having problem in one way or the other. But I think there's a question in the chat box for Mallam Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, and it's around how do we ensure more civil society participation in this conversation, both monitoring and discussion around debt forgiveness? And another question for you, sir, is around your perspective to government's proposal to spend and $1.5 billion on Port Harcourt refinery. Although that doesn't relate directly to debt, or maybe in the future it can also add up to the debt issue. So Calvin and Mallam Sanusi Lamido, if you can quickly respond to those two questions.
Well, thank you very much. Look, I would rather not make any comment on the $1.5 billion spending on refinery. I think it's been widely discussed. There have been a number of figures thrown around. I think Atedo Peterson has made the point that perhaps it's better off government better off just handing the refinery over to Dangote and spending the money better on education and healthcare. But this is a controversy I do not want to get into at this moment. On the question of civil societies, in 2004, civil society was very much involved in the campaign for debt relief. I don't, the whole idea of civil society is you don't need anyone's permission to be out there. And the level of education of civil society is what will determine the quality of the discourse. Many of the signals were there, many of the policy wrong policy missteps were very clear. I think anybody would have told you that we would probably end up like this if we were hit by a crisis that we were going. We need to have more and more voices out there, basically by the conversation, alert the population and check the excesses of political authorities. So I can only encourage civil society to be more bold, more vocal, and more organized in this process.
Thank you so much. Calvin, your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you for the great question. And absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more that the private sector has been, especially the bondholder community, has been the biggest laggard in the COVID-19 crisis. A third of the emerging market and developing country debt is in the private bondholder sector, and there hasn't been any meaningful engagement except for in Ecuador and Argentina, and those were controversial to say the least. So in our scheme, we propose that multilateral development banks use their balance sheets to bring the private sector to the table through credit enhancement, and analogous to the Brady era, to provide a guarantee for a handful of years or something like that, on condition that the private sector renegotiates debt at a discount. In other words, with a haircut. We think that that is something that we're pushing for that at the sort of global level through the G20. And hopefully now that we've taken the first step in a new allocation of special drawing rights, we can move on in 2021 to think more sophisticated about the growing debt problem. But even within the current frameworks, Nigeria, if they chose to go to the common framework, could ask for restructuring to ask them MDBs to come in and be part of the story through a credit enhancement kind of a scheme, with a pledge for many of the reforms and policy shifts that you folks in Nigeria have been talking about, that you know better and what are more appropriate for your country than I certainly do. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Calvin. Maybe before you mute yourself, I just want to ask a question that about the posers that Brian highlighted. I mean, he mentioned 4 things to put in the consideration. And I don't think this is a question just for Nigeria. It's something that relates to many developing countries. So if countries cannot actually address this issue, do you think the appetite for this forgiveness is there among development partners? I mean, have you spoken in terms of what are the appetite for this among donors?
Yeah, the World Bank and the IMF has a working group, and they're proposing a clearinghouse to start looking into this a lot more seriously. so they can do evaluations, help countries that see that they're in debt distress, and help figure out ways for them to get concessional financing, grant financing, and in certain cases, restructuring that's tied to the kinds of reforms and investments in a more green and inclusive recovery. So that's going on at the staff level. That's being discussed there. We're trying to put input on that and raise awareness. In addition to credit enhancement, there can be sticks as well. The UK during the HIPC era had legislation that compelled the private sector to be more engaged in these negotiations. And during the Iraq War, the United States has an executive order that compelled the private sector to lay off on lawsuits and to engage more in restructuring. So there are things countries like Nigeria can do, engage into these programs and ask, but there also needs to be a global effort. That's something that we're pushing through our group, the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery.
Thank you, Kevin. And so I will go back to the audience now, and I can see Chioma Hodge, you have a question, and you can go ahead and ask your question now. Okay, I think we have problem with that. Can Olabisi Akinkobe, you can ask your question now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists for a very interesting set of discussions. My question really goes to the role of the states in debt matrix in the Nigerian community. The rise in popularity of PPP projects, I think, is one area where the debt profile of many of the states hasn't really been accounted for. So I'm curious to hear any of the panelists' thought on how Nigeria as a state, in thinking of our debt reliefs and future planning, really accounts for this really sometimes very difficult and complex loan that states may have gotten, which we really do not then account for as part of our planning.
I think my colleague Umar Amara can respond to that. So Chioma Hodge, I think you are back. Can you ask your question now?
Hi, I would like to ask a question to whoever, like either Ma or any other person who's willing to answer. But I feel like debt haircuts are more feasible as opposed to like a whole debt relief. So my question is just, is there like an argument for haircuts? Because throughout this conversation, there hasn't been anything about like a possible haircuts in the debt restructuring and all that process, as opposed to like a whole debt relief. Because a debt relief in this period of time, in the time constraints, I don't really think that's going to happen. So I'm more for like, how are there going to be possible debt restructurings and haircuts?
Okay, thank you for your question. And Leah Solomon, can you ask your question too? I just want to gather like 3-4 questions and we end it on that note. So sorry about that. Solomon? Solomon? Okay. So I think I can quickly move to Umar. Umar, you can ask your question now.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Umar.
Yeah, my question is to the former CVN governor. I think the expert have said it clearly, and the representative of the Ministry of Finance has said that she will take it to the ministry. So my question is. Would the former CVN governor shed more light on how Nigeria should use the proposal put in place by the expert here in order to address the revenue spending on the debt servicing?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that question. And the last question, Donald Ikena, if you can go last on this and have your take on this. Hello, Donald. Okay, I think we are having issue with connecting with Donald, but I think we can go back to our panelists to, you have questions to whom I think there's a question to Mallam Sanusi, and there's also a question for Calvin. So you can use this as your last take on this conversation. So over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Deji. So the question on the lack of data for the PPP projects, that's public-private partnership projects, I highlighted that, during my presentation, how the official figures do not account for everything. So there are project loans taken on by state governments, even project loans taken on by the project sponsors as well, that are not accounted for in the official figures. However, the World Bank collates data on those loans. It's important for the DMO to incorporate this in their assessment of the debt profile. I don't know if a representative of the DMO is here, the Debt Management Office, to take this recommendation.
For that, I think Calvin, do you want to speak to some of the questions that has been both dropped in the Q&A and asked directly?
Yeah, I've been trying to answer as many as I can on the side here. Which ones have I missed? I see one from, let's see. Is there one in particular you'd like me to? I don't see any others.
So there's a question for you that can your proposal relate to CMD mechanism and carbon credit to countries? That's from Akama.
Good question. So the clean development mechanism is an interesting mechanism, and obviously this year, unless COVID makes it be canceled, there'll be a conference on the parties of the Paris Climate Agreement in Scotland later this year. One of the pieces of unfinished business is what kind of credit, if any, can an advanced economy get if it invests in clean energy somewhere else. That would really help create better incentives for private sector engagement and for more grant funding, especially, and more equity investment. I'm not. If you actually look at one of our background papers on drgr.org, written by Rishi Bandari and Anna Maria Viterbo, we actually discuss the extent to which the clean development mechanism could be adapted, or those kinds of incentives could be into the Paris Climate Agreement. I'll put that into the chat really quick. But it's important. The more incentives that we could have for grant and concessional finance and equity in clean energy and carbon transformations through the UN Climate Agreement, that would be important. And the CDM is somewhat of an example of how that could work.
Thank you, Calvin. And before I move to the last discussant, there's a question here for Mr. Lauye Jayola from NESG. And the question is from Donald Ikena. He's asking you around, what do you envisage as the next step after this conversation? Do you think a debt roundtable it's going to take place, and how do you want to push other civil society actors into that conversation?
Thank you very much. Just to, like I did say, the NASG set up a debt roundtable just last month, courtesy of OSIWA, and we'll try to work as many think tanks and civil society as possible to ensure that we have a coordinated approach and response and engagement with government. on the matter.
Well, thanks, and hope to have a very good conversation, and hope some of the suggestions that you have picked from this gathering would nudge and guide the conversation at the roundtable. So finally, I think I would like Mallam Sanusi Lamido to respond to some of the questions that has actually been raised for you too, sir. And that will be the final comment before we round up.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll just address two. There was a comment on the preference for a haircut over debt relief. I think the document that we're discussing actually is one that is based on the principle of haircuts, not outright debt cancellation. It's about a certain amount of relief that is matched by an equal amount of investment in specified projects. So I think that answers the question. Broadly speaking on what advice would give the government, first of all, I think we need to understand that there are two different issues. There's the issue of the immediate responses, and clearly we're in this situation today because we've had pre-existing conditions, and then COVID came, and the fiscal space is not there. So this is not the time to go into massive fiscal consolidation. And that's the truth. We can't start retrenching workers, for example, to cut costs. It will just add to poverty and unemployment. We cannot increase taxes beyond a certain amount. It will simply kill industries that are already reading from other costs, inflation, exchange rates, and so on. So we're left with no choice but to begin to look at how you can reduce the debt service burden, and therefore debt service becomes about the only viable short-term alternative. But beyond that, as Nigerians, we've got to address the root cause of the problem. And I'm not going to be talking about corruption and all that, which we all talk about. But let's even ask ourselves certain deep political questions at the structure of our government and constitution. When I was governor of the central bank, we had oil revenues, all priced about $100 a barrel, producing about 2 million barrels a day. And in spite of that, 80% of government revenue was going into revenue expenditure, basically salaries and overheads. Now, look at the constitution that we have, look at the structure that we have. We have 36 states in the federation. We have 774 local government areas. Each local government has a chairman, a speaker, about 10 councillors with their personal staff. Each state has a governor, a deputy governor, and a state legislature, in addition to the civil service. Okay, so imagine the hundreds and hundreds of legislators that we have, the hundreds and hundreds of local government personnel that we have by constitution. The presidents, you have a president and a vice president. The constitution requires us to have a minister from every state, so a minimum of 36 ministers. We have a bicameral legislature, 360 members of the House of Reps, 109 senators. Each of these political office holders has a retinue of personal staff, vehicles, and so on. We have set ourselves up to fail. I mean, if you're lending money to a company, to a manufacturer, and the bulk of the money is going on the salary of the managing director and the management and petrol for the cars and maintenance of the houses, you have a bad loan. So even if you have a debt relief, if we don't come to terms with the fact that we have politically set ourselves up with a structure that is unsustainable in terms of cost, we are not going to go anywhere. So these are questions. We're talking about restriction. These are questions, constitutional questions that need to be looked at to address the issue. And I've talked about population growth. I've talked about basically the use of the environment, the way we allocate land resources, the preservation of land for agriculture, water resources. These are policies that we need to look at. So if you ask me, what should, I mean, I'm all for debt relief, but I really think debt relief should be within the context of a very clear policy direction that shows that if we have this debt relief this time, we are going to have a more sustainable economy. We're not going to come back in the next 5-10 years asking for that. These are the kinds of issues, and there isn't enough time in 5 minutes to talk about them, but these are point us to, at least for me, where my mind is on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I mean, the point you made around when we have conversation about debt relief, it should be for development and development alone and concrete development. I think that is well taken. So on my part, I think I just want to thank the panelists, the discussants, and the contributors for your great insight and education. I've learned so much, and I really want to appreciate everyone for your time. So I will hand it back to Jochem from HBS to just give the final remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Deji. My line is quite unstable. I hope you can hear me. So I will keep it very short. Also, just from my side, thank you very much again for all your insights and contributions. I think it's been a very insightful and interesting 1.5 hours. It confirmed that Nigeria is indeed in a situation where there is a need to talk about debt relief. But as we talk about that, there's obviously very many things to consider. Not only how we go about debt relief itself, and what Nigeria could bring to the table in terms of policies that would further social and climate progress, but also that would avoid, in the end, a situation where we have another round of debt relief and then 5 to 10 years later down the line in the exact same situation. So there's questions of accountability and transparency that we need to strongly consider in that. With that, I'm really looking forward to continue and deepen the conversation with some of you and try to start work out the specificities of how such a package could look like in the Nigerian context, working from the framework that has been put forward by Kevin. So we will be in touch with you, and thank you very much, and we'll talk again.